It's a shame that we have well-known people like Beck and Hannity and O'Reilly, who I believe has to know the information I'm going to be giving you. Has to know it. Has to know his connections. And yet are afraid. They're afraid to speak openly before the fear of being called racist. Now, King's mentor was a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. You can look him up on the internet. You can look him up in Wikipedia. W.E.B. Du Bois. He died one day before King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. At the urging of King, there was a moment of silence held to commemorate the memory of W.E.B. Du Bois. However, Du Bois, King's mentor, W.E.B. Du Bois, the mentor of Martin Luther King, was a well-known communist. And upon the death of the brutal dictator Joseph Stalin, he's the one that butchered millions of people in the Soviet Union. Yes, that Joseph Stalin. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about the memory of Joseph Stalin, and in March 16, 1933, in the National Guardian, a leftist socialist publication, W.E.B. Du Bois, the mentor of Martin Luther King, said, quote, Joseph Stalin was a great man. Few other men of the 20th century approached his stature. Martin Luther King's mentor admired Joseph Stalin. What does that say about Martin Luther King, Mr. Beck, Mr. O'Reilly, or Sean Hannity? And all you good conservative Tea Party people, many of whom I agree and embrace as my friends, because I agree so much with what you're saying. What does that say about this man that we are told that we are to emulate? Dr. Martin Luther King, the man that we are told to honor and respect, chose as his mentor a man who admired the most brutal dictator of the 20th century. Doesn't that seem a little odd to you? But Du Bois' communism didn't seem to bother King. Just 40 days before he was assassinated, 40 days before King was assassinated, King spoke at Carnegie Hall in New York City. And he was honoring the 100th anniversary of the birth of W.E.B. Du Bois. 40 days before King was assassinated, in Carnegie Hall in New York, a great memorial was held honoring the birthday of W.E.B. Du Bois, the communist who admired Joseph Stalin. Here is what Martin Luther King said at that memorial. Quote, it is time to cease muting the fact that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois was a genius and chose to be a communist. Our irrational, he calls it, our irrational obsessive anti-communism has led us into too many quagmires to be restrained as if it were a mode of scientific thinking. He said we need to get rid of this idea of being anti-communist. And he's honoring W.E.B. Du Bois. Martin Luther King, Mr. Beck, O'Reilly, Hannity, conservatives. Martin Luther King is the one you want to honor as a great American, admired a communist, a socialist, a progressive, one that wanted to destroy our republic. Martin Luther King. And you're telling our children we should honor this man? Certainly you know that. Certainly Mr. Beck, O'Reilly, and Hannity, and others, certainly you know that. Why do you honor Martin Luther King? Is this really a man that you want our children to idolize? Who are some of the King's other associates? Oh yes, he has others. Bayard Rustin. He, along with King and Alinsky, had studied Gandhi's teachings. And Rustin was another one of King's mentors and his an advisor. He was Rustin was one who was the main organizer behind the 1963 March on Washington. He was a close associate of King, and he was an open sodomite and supported Bayard Rustin, another mentor of King, helped organize the 63 March in Washington, was a sodomite. He was a supporter of democratic socialism and had cozy ties with the Communist Party. Many of King's supporters were convinced and concerned that his continuous open association with Rustin could hurt the civil rights and social justice movement. And they asked King to kind of pull back a little bit of such a close association. They thought it might hurt the movement. Another one that King admired and worked with King was James Farmer. James Farmer. He was a close associate of Martin Luther King. He was in jail at the time that King had his march on Washington in 1963. But during the 1950s, Farmer served as the National Secretary of the Student League for Industrial Democracy. Later, it was changed to the name Students for a Democratic Society. He was also honorary chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is an affiliate of the Socialist International, a federation of social democratic and social progressives. This was King's associate. And you're trying to tell me that King was a great American? And yet you want to attack Barack Obama for hanging out with the same kind of people that Martin Luther King hung out with? Remember, progressives, those are the guys that y'all keep warning us about, and rightly so. But why are you trying to hide the progressive agenda of King? I can understand you trying to expose all these other people, but why are you hiding the progressive agenda of Martin Luther King? Why don't one of you guys make it a topic of one of your shows sometime? Why do people have to come to the internet or to YouTube to learn this when the information is so freely out there? Why are you willing to hide it? Seems odd. Stanley David Levinson. He was a lifelong activist in socialist causes. He was also known as an advisor to King. And he was a close friend of King's. And he helped write Martin Luther King's speeches. And he helped organize his events. Levinson was instrumental in all the activities of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the organization established by Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and others. He was in charge of much of the fundraising for the organization and took many of the publicity tasks upon himself. And also he served as King's literary agent, and he was a close advisor to King. Stanley David Levinson. Levinson was introduced to King by Bayard Rustin, the communist we just read about, the sodomite we just talked about a moment ago. Levinson was introduced to King by Bayard Rustin, and in 1956 was active in the leadership Communist Party. In 1956, he was active in the Communist Party. I want to make sure I get that right. And throughout the 50s, he was active in the Communist Party. Then he became associated with the King in the late 50s. Did you guys overlook that? You overlook that little tidbit? I don't know. Here's a colorful character, Robert Williams. Robert Williams in the 1960s was afraid that he was going to be arrested by the FBI. He became concerned, became fearful that the FBI was going to arrest him, and so he fled to Cuba, communist Cuba, and became the honored guest of Fidel Castro. And then he organized a radio station in Cuba called Radio Free Dixie. And he established it with the help of Fidel Castro, the communist brutal dictator of Cuba. And I know you can see pictures of him now. He looks old and frail. But you don't remember him. A lot of you were too young to know the brutal mayhem that this man conducted through Cuba. People, by hundreds of thousands, were murdered in the streets and in the churches, and raped, murdered, and blood flowing in the streets of Havana by Fidel Castro. Well, Robert Williams goes to Cuba, organizes a radio station, Radio Free Dixie. Fidel Castro helps him to organize it, gets it up and running, and then he broadcast into the southern states, and he advised American Negroes to arm themselves, take up guns, and prepare to make war against the white man. In 1965, he left Cuba and he went to communist China. They don't call it communist China anymore, but that's what it is. He fled to, not fled, but he went to communist China. He returned to the United States in 1969, and the United States government assumed, because he had this close association with Martin Luther King and had a close association with the late Malcolm X, that he was going to take up the vacuum that occurred. When he died in 1996, when Robert Williams died in 1996, this communist, this friend of Fidel Castro, there's one who advocated for blacks to pick up guns and go to war against whites. When he died, guess who came to his funeral? Oh, the little old Rosa Parks. And, the same Rosa Parks, yes, the same Rosa Parks that launched the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott that they show pictures of, which look so dainty and quiet, elderly black woman. They don't show the red revolutionary, bloodthirsty side of her. In 1996, when Robert Williams died, Rosa Parks was at his funeral, and she gave eulogies to Robert Williams and spoke of the high regard, quote unquote, high regard that civil rights activists had for Robert Williams, his friend of Fidel Castro. Another associate of Martin Luther King was James Dombrowski. Dombrowski, along with Miles Horton and Don West, created the Highlander Folk School in Mount Eagle, Tennessee in 1932. Paul Crouch, who defected from communism, not the Paul Crouch on TBN, a different Paul Crouch. Paul Crouch, who defected from communism after serving for many years as a top U.S. communist in the South, and who taught revolution and subversion for the communists in Moscow, testified before the Senate Internal Securities Subcommittee and said, quote, Dombrowski told me on several occasions that he preferred to be called a socialist rather than a communist because he could serve the revolutionary movement better under the socialist label than under the communist label.